There are stories about the West that are carried like ghosts, tales of gunslingers, train robbers, dreamers, and drifters. But among all those fading legends, few are as tragic or as haunting as the slow destruction of the Van der Linde gang. This is not simply a story of criminals chased by the law. It is the story of a family collapsing under the weight of loyalty, ambition, and the inevitable death of the world they belong to. At the center of that collapse stand two men, Dutch van der Linde, the visionary outlaw who believed he could outrun civilization itself, and Arthur Morgan, his closest follower, his student, his enforcer, and perhaps the only man who understood what the gang truly meant. But the gang's downfall did not begin with betrayal, nor with violence. It began with a dream, Dutch's dream, and the slow, painful realization that the world had already begun to wake up from it. Part I, Dutch van der Linde, a dreamer built from fire and smoke before the collapse, before the losses and the tension and the whispers of doubt. Dutch was something rare in a dying West, a man who could convince others to believe in impossible things. His speeches weren't mere words. They were promises of freedom, of dignity, of a life where no government, no corporation, no railroad baron could tell you who to be. Dutch positioned himself not as a criminal, but as a philosopher armed with a revolver. He spoke of liberty with the confidence of a prophet, and the gang followed because he made them feel like they were more than outlaws. He made them feel like they were part of a cause. And in truth, Dutch did have principles once. He cared for people who had nowhere else to go. He took broken, abandoned children and made them feel like they mattered. He often tried to avoid unnecessary harm, encouraged restraint, preached about doing things the right way, even in a world that punished men like him. But Dutch's tragedy is that he loved the idea of freedom more than the messy, complicated reality of the people who followed him. His vision was flawless. His humanity was not. If Dutch was the fire that fueled the gang, Arthur was the stone that grounded it, taken in as a boy, raised by Dutch and HOSEA. Arthur grew into the gang's most dependable force. He wasn't the loudest, he wasn't the most emotional, but everything, every conflict, every escape, passed through him in some way. Arthur's loyalty to Dutch was not a simple affection, it was a foundational truth. Dutch was the man who taught him how to survive, how to think, how to navigate a world that didn't offer second chances. Arthur had never known a real family outside the gang. Dutch and HOSEA weren't just leaders, they were his fathers. But Arthur's tragedy is that he mistook loyalty for destiny. He believed the gang was the only life available to him, even when cracks began to form. He loved Dutch the way a child loves a parent, unconditionally, even when that parent begins to lose their way. This is why the gang's decline cuts so deep through him. He isn't losing a leader, he is losing the man who shaped his entire world. HOSEA Matthews, the quiet voice of reality in the shadows, the co-founder of the gang, and the man who acted as its conscience long before Arthur ever picked up a gun. HOSEA was not a dreamer, but a realist. He knew the West was changing. He saw the world Dutch refused to see. One where telegraph wires crossed the sky like spiderwebs, where lawmen rode with organization and purpose, where notoriety was a death sentence, not a badge of honor, where Dutch fought the future with bravado. HOSEA tried to guide the gang around it with caution. It was HOSEA who taught Arthur how to read people. It was HOSEA who taught Dutch patience. It was HOSEA who told the younger members stories not of revolution, but of survival. And as Dutch's plans grew larger and riskier, HOSEA's warnings grew more frequent and more ignored. The gang's tragedy is not simply that Dutch fell into madness. It is that the man who kept Dutch grounded began to lose the ability to reach him. A family of misfits and the illusion of peace despite the violence, despite the robberies, despite the endless running. The gang's camps were often filled with warmth. In the glow of a campfire, their story looks like a portrait of human connection no outlaw label could erase. The Marstons tried to build something resembling a normal family. Charles found meaning in belonging rather than bloodline. Sadie awakened strength she never knew she possessed. Javier and Bill struggled with their own insecurities, masking them with bravado. Lenny carried hope for a future he hadn't yet realized was slipping away. Strauss, grim and detached, provided the gang's financial heart whether anyone liked it or not. Tilly, Mary Beth, Karen, each carried their own dreams, small yet significant, bound together by the belief that Dutch would eventually lead them to a place where they could finally rest. These weren't villains, they were survivors. And for a time, Dutch truly did keep them safe. But safety based on ideals alone cannot withstand the grinding gears of a world accelerating toward modernity. The gang lived in a snow globe of illusion, and the glass was beginning to crack. The Old West dies slowly. Not with a final shot, the collapse of the Van der Linde gang cannot be understood without understanding the slow disappearance of the frontier. It wasn't gunfights, outlaws, or rival gangs that killed the Old West. It was progress, the quiet kind that happens while people are too busy running from the past to see the future forming around them. Trains grew faster, towns grew larger, telegraphs connected cities like veins on a leaf. Pinkertons emerged as the relentless face of an organized government. The gang's ideology, freedom through defiance, was not built to survive in a world built on systems and surveillance. Dutch believed the world was conspiring against him, but the truth was colder and far more tragic. The world wasn't hunting the gang specifically. The world was simply leaving them behind. To a man like Dutch, that irrelevance felt like a personal attack. To Arthur, it felt like losing the only identity he'd ever known. The cracks begin with whispers, not gunfire. There was no loud moment where everything changed. The collapse did not begin with a single failure, but with subtle shifts that could only be seen in hindsight. Plans became more desperate. Tensions grew thicker. Members began questioning decisions in private. Voices hushed but shaking. Some sought security, people like Abigail and Tilly, who began to desire something stable, something safe. Others sought glory, like Bill and Javier, who clung to Dutch's increasing recklessness because it made them feel powerful. Still others sought purpose. Sadie and Charles, who longed for clarity in a world growing muddled by fear and doubt. And then there were those whose motives were darker, whose presence thrived in chaos. Men who whispered in Dutch's ear when he was weakest, who stoked the flames of paranoia and pride. Arthur saw all of this, but he believed it was temporary, a rough patch, a bad season, a passing storm. He didn't understand yet that storms don't pass when you're already sailing toward the rocks. Dutch's idealism erodes into something more dangerous. But as the world closed in, his certainty turned brittle. He wasn't a tyrant at first. He wasn't a monster. He was a man terrified of losing the world that defined him. A man who needed control not because he was power-hungry, but because control was the only thing that kept his dream alive. The tragedy is that Dutch became a prisoner of the very ideals he preached. He could not admit he was wrong. He could not accept reality. He could not allow anyone, Arthur, Jose, or even John, to question him without feeling betrayed. What the gang saw as concern, Dutch saw as disloyalty. What they saw as reckless, Dutch saw as necessary. He wasn't falling apart all at once. He was cracking slowly, painfully, under pressures a younger Dutch might have handled with grace. Arthur watched this unraveling with the kind of heartbreak only a son can feel when his father begins to fade. Arthur's internal collapse mirrors the gang's. As the gang weakens, so does Arthur's sense of identity. He begins to question the ideals he once carved into stone. He sees the toll on the people he cares about. He senses the fractures widening. But Arthur cannot simply walk away. Not from Dutch, not from the gang, not from the life that raised him. He tries to hold everything together, protecting the young, guiding the lost, confronting the reckless, becoming the glue for a group that no longer sees its own deterioration. Arthur's internal journey becomes a metaphor for the gang's fate, the struggle to hold on to something that is already collapsing. John Marston is the only one who openly represents a different path. He doesn't articulate it well, he doesn't even fully understand it. But Abigail's dreams for Jack become a symbolic mirror of what the gang cannot grasp. A life beyond violence, a future beyond outlaw identity. Arthur sees something in John, something fragile but promising, a chance for someone, anyone, to break the cycle. But that hope creates a painful tension. Arthur wants to help John rise. Dutch wants to pull everyone back into his dream. And in that quiet tug of war, the gang's fate becomes sealed. Not by conflict, but by incompatibility. Dutch wants things to stay the same. John wants something new. Arthur is torn between the two. And the world. The world wants none of them. The tragedy that was always inevitable, the collapse of the Van der Linde gang, was not a matter of betrayal or misfortune. It was the natural, heartbreaking conclusion of a dream that could not survive the march of time. Dutch's idealism could not withstand modernity. Arthur's loyalty could not withstand reality. HOSEA's wisdom could not withstand stubbornness. The gang's love could not withstand the pressures closing in from both outside and within. Their tragedy is not that they failed. Their tragedy is that they believed they could win against the inevitable. They lived as though the West would always welcome men like them. But history had already turned the page, and the world that Arthur Morgan loved, lawless, wild, untamed, was already dying long before anyone in the gang realized it. Their fall was not a moment. It was a long, painful descent into a future that never wanted them. The legacy of the Van der Linde gang lingers not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder of the fragile nature of ideals. Dutch dreamed of freedom, Arthur dreamed of loyalty, HOSEA dreamed of peace, the others dreamed of belonging, respect, survival, meaning, but dreams cannot stand alone. They need a world willing to support them. And the world of Red Dead Redemption 2 was already moving on. The gang's collapse is tragic not because it was violent, but because it was human, achingly, painfully human. A story of people who loved each other, failed each other, and could not escape the tides of history. In the end, Dutch's dream consumed everyone it touched, including the dreamer himself. And the ghosts of what they could have been continue to ride through the West long after the dust has settled. They are remembered not for how they died, but for how desperately they tried to live.